The roads leading into ancient Rome are dotted with tombs and monuments, some dedicated to emperors, generals, statesmen. But there is one interesting among them. It is the tomb of Marcus Vergilius Uricesius. Not an emperor or general, not even a great warrior. No, Marcus was actually a baker. He was once an enslaved man, and later turned into a prosperous freedman, building an elaborate tomb adorned with carved scenes of his bread-making. You see, he made his fortune not by going and conquering foreign lands by the sword, but just by making food, kneading dough. Well, it's a reminder that the real backbone of the Roman world was not just its famous legions, but the ordinary people with the myriad of jobs that they performed from day to day. Of course, when we think of ancient Rome, we often picture soldiers in that glinting armor and the senators in flowing togas. Yet the vast majority of Romans lived far from the spotlight of the forum and from the battlefield. So how did these men and women earn their keep? What was work like for the average Roman across the centuries of the Republic and the Empire? Well, it's a good question, and we are going to talk about that today. Just about how normal people made a living. And there's a few interesting little stories along the way, too. I've been looking forward to this one, and I hope you enjoy it. Now, before we go into it, I'd like to issue the customary welcome to the channel. For anybody who's new here, I invite you to subscribe. If you enjoy this kind of content, you'll get plenty more of it. And thank you to anyone returning. You will get no mid-roll ads on these videos. That's the whole channel, by the way. Completely ad-free because of the generous donations on the PayPal and YouTube memberships, the Patreon, this kind of thing, and the super thanks. Thank you very much. And for those who checked out the merch store, lots of little goodies there. Now, with welcomes all said and done, let's get nice and relaxed and we can begin our journey into the jobs of ancient Rome. Well, let's start by building a bit of a foundation of Roman society. Let's have a look at the work system and the class system back in the Roman world. You see, work was both a necessity for the many and a mark of low status in the eyes of the elite. See, the Latin language itself reflected its ambivalence to it. The ideal state for a person of means was known as otium. That is a Latin term, known basically as a lifestyle of leisurely freedom, whereas negotium, literally meaning not otium, meant business, the busy occupation of everyday work, and it was a little bit looked down upon by Rome's aristocratic classes, which are, well, most unfortunately, the only ones that we really hear from in writing. Now, Rome's aristocrats prided themselves on being above manual or paid labor. The statesman-philosopher Cicero, writing in the 1st century BCE, declared that, quote, "The cash that comes from selling your labor is vulgar and unsuited for a gentleman, for wages are effectively the bonds of slavery." Well, fighting words from the working man. In his view, a truly respectable Roman ought to be supported by the proceeds of his estates, that is, rents from farms or properties, rather than working by the hour for payment. Now, this elite disdain for wage labor became a bit of a cliché in the Roman moralizing literature of the time. Yet Cicero's lofty pronouncements were not utterly out of step with the reality that faced most Romans. The truth was that the vast majority of people in the Roman Empire had to work for a living. Not everybody had estates and all the rest to live off. As in any pre-industrial society, continuous labor was the norm, and survival depended on it. You didn't work, you did not eat. And there was no concept of a welfare state even to fall back on. You couldn't just go and get a government dole for unemployment, apart from the grain rations that were provided to Rome's poorest citizens, but well, that didn't really get you too far. If a person could not find work, well, there was hunger to contend with. So for ordinary Romans of the lower classes, a job was not just a way to earn money, but often a core part of their identity. Many of the urban poor worked every possible day until they could physically no longer continue, often until illness or death, because stopping, well, that meant destitution. And retirement, virtually unheard of, except for the lucky soldiers who, after 20 or 25 years of service, might receive a land pension to farm. And even children were not exempt from the hard realities of work. Contemporary evidence, including archaeology, reveals that many children in ancient Rome labored from a very young age. The bones of youths excavated at Roman work sites show signs of strain and injury consistent with hard physical labor. We've actually got a good example of this, a cemetery outside of Rome, near the site of an old fuller's workshop. If you don't know what a fuller is, it's basically a laundry that cleaned cloth. Well, this site contained the remains of adolescents whose bones bore the telltale deformities of repetitive work, likely from strenuous pounding and treading that was involved in the cloth processing. Now, you especially see this in children too, because children's bones are quite malleable when everything's still growing in. Well, definitely much easier to deform when the bones are still softer than an adult's. At least that is my understanding of it. Well, in another case, an epitaph from a Spanish mining region commemorated a boy of about 4 years old, believe it or not, poignantly depicted carrying his little bag of tools. Modern observers might hope that this was just a miner's mascot or something like that. But it's probably likely that he was indeed put to work in the mines as soon as he was able to walk and carry a tool. After all, those small spaces, they needed the little people to get into them. Well, childhood, as we think of today, was not a protected, idle time for most Roman kids. No, it was common for the children of the poor, whether free or enslaved, to start contributing to the family trade or chores as soon as they were physically capable. Only the offspring of the rich had the luxury of devoting their youth purely to education and play. As for everyone else learning a skill or trade early, well, that was just the reality of growing up. No use complaining about it, just get on with the job. Now we have social attitudes. Well, those attitudes towards workers were deeply colored by the class prejudice of the day. But at the same time, work was ubiquitous and crucial. Even senators who scorned the, quote, vulgar jobs relied on the products of those jobs every single day. The bread baked by the baker, the toga cleaned by the fuller. And of course, everyone has to eat too, so don't forget those peasants plowing the field. The reality of the Roman economy was that it was an all-hands-on-deck operation. Now, historians have identified over 200 distinct occupations mentioned in Roman inscriptions and texts, and I don't think we'll be going through every 200 or all 200 of them today, but we'll pick out the most interesting ones. In fact, many ordinary people were proud enough of their professions to actually mention them on their tombstones. Unlike the grand monuments of generals boasting of battles won, the humble gravestones of common folk often state something like, "Here lies so-and-so, carpenter or fuller," or woman's grave might mention that she was a midwife, something like this. In fact, it might even sometimes have accompanied images carved onto there of their tools of the trade. Like we said, somebody's work becomes their identity. But don't think of that as too alien, because even in our modern era, one of the first questions we often ask people is what work they do. We don't ask them, oh, what books do you like? What music do you like? When we want to get an overall gauge of someone's personality, it's generally the first question that we ask, because people spend 8 hours a day, 5 days a week generally doing this. So it's a good place to start, I suppose. Now, one ex-slave in Rome, and here's an interesting one. He was named Gaius Poppaeus Amicus. Yes, Gaius Poppaeus Amicus, excuse me. He had his career literally etched in stone. He described himself as purpurarius, that is, a dyer of the precious Tyrian purple cloth, and his tomb was decorated with the implements of his craft. Many other tombs, especially in the city of Rome and other urban centers, show people depicted at work. Relief carvings show butchers with their tools at the trade, midwives delivering children, shoemakers at the bench. Might even have a vendor proudly showing off his stall of live poultry. But far from feeling ashamed, these people made their work a centerpiece of their life story. They were proud of what they were doing. In a culture where the upper crust touted their political officers and noble lineage, the common people found their own dignity. After all, everyone needs a bit of meaning to their lives, don't they? But this all being said, you can't discuss work in ancient Rome without mentioning the enormous role of slavery. It's kind of hard to ignore. A significant portion of the labor force in Rome was done by enslaved people who had no freedom to choose their occupation. And if you did, it was probably, would you like to be a coal miner or a galley slave? It's not really a good choice. Now, slavery in Rome permeated nearly every economic sector. Slaves toiled in the fields, the mines, the workshops, the households. They were everywhere. And it wasn't just men either. There could be men, women, or children, and their working conditions ranged from horrific to tolerable. An educated slave might work as a secretary, a teacher, or even a physician in a nice little villa, while another slave had to suffer in chains in a dirty old mine, or trudged behind a plow on a remote farm off there in the middle of nowhere. Now, because slaves were considered property, their labor was extracted by force and usually unpaid. Okay, beyond basic sustenance, you would have a few scraps of food thrown to you, enough to keep you in shape for work, I suppose. But this massive underclass of forced laborers coexisted with free workers, and sometimes even competed with them for jobs. In cities, many crafts and services were carried out by slaves who belonged to wealthy masters. Let's take, for example, large households would have slave cooks, slave weavers making the families' clothing, slave bakers, and even slave tutors for their children. The prevalence of slave labor meant that free, poor Romans often struggled to find paid work, especially in unskilled roles, because, an affluent household might just get slaves instead. You can see how this is a pretty big problem. And this reminds us, too, that pretty much throughout all of human history, the general population viewed slavery as a bit of a blight. Perhaps not for sentimental reasons all the time, or perhaps so. Of course, people back then had their own opinions on things. But for very practical reasons, that it messed up the labor market for the ordinary worker. Anyway, that is a Topic for another video, I suppose. In any case, this dynamic contributed to the economic precarity of many free citizens and was one reason behind the government's provision of free grain in the city of Rome, essentially a food subsidy to prevent people from rioting, the jobless urban masses losing their temper. But despite this, many free men and women did make their living through skilled trades, small businesses, or as a hired laborer. Furthermore, when slaves were freed, which thousands were every year, by the way, they joined the ranks of these free workers. These freedmen and freedwomen often continued in the trades that they already knew or started up small enterprises of their own, forming an important middle stratum of Roman society. Some of them rose to impressive prosperity, as our baker Ulysses did, even having that big tomb of his. Isn't that interesting? Well, in fact, literary satire poked fun at how freedmen were becoming actually quite rich. Petronius, in his Satyricon, depicts a lavish banquet hosted by the freedman Trimalchio, where guests, many of them ex-slaves made free, brag about their earnings and shrewd business ventures. One character at the dinner, himself a former slave-turned-cloth dealer, extols the value of a practical education and a good trade to make your living. Here's the quote. He says, "An education is an investment, and a proper profession never goes dead on you." Well, I like that. An education is an investment. You can't disagree with that, surely. Well, such voices from the literature confirm that, even if old aristocrats sneered, the working people of Rome respected the hard-earned money and the skills that provided it. Now, we're about to go into specific occupations, but before we do, it's worth noting one more development over the centuries, especially the late Empire, that is, the 3rd and 4th centuries of our Common Era. The Roman state began to regulate certain professions more tightly. That's right. Government regulation, which is, well, a little bit touch and go. There was a growing tendency to hereditary occupations, a far cry from the earlier days when a free man could theoretically choose any path of work. By Emperor Diocletian's time, that is the late 3rd century, in response to labor shortages and economic turmoil, laws were passed that tied people to their trades and even to their social positions. Certain essential jobs like baking or shipping grain to the capital were turned into compulsory services that often passed from father to son. Let's take bakers, for instance. They were organized into a collegium, that is, the old word for guild, and eventually required by law to keep their bakeries running to ensure the city's bread supply. If you were a baker, you couldn't just shrug your shoulders and quit the trade. No, your work was far too important to the survival of the state. They wouldn't let you do that. And this trend only intensified under Constantine and later emperors, laying the groundwork for what would become a more rigid structure in the post-Roman medieval world. The freewheeling days of the early empire, when a clever freedman might become a wealthy merchant, gave way to an era where many occupations were effectively locked in by birth and law. But nevertheless, throughout the Roman Empire's long history, from the Republic to the late Empire, everyday jobs remained pretty similar in their nature. Farming, cooking, building, sewing, trading, teaching, and cleaning. Day in, day out. Well, let's think about the foundation of the Roman economy, and certainly the most common occupation by far, especially in the earlier periods of Roman history, and that's agriculture. You know, often you hear about people doing things like this. I don't know if you heard of past life regression, all that sort of thing. People do this meditation stuff. And they say, oh yes, I was once a Roman legionary soldier, and then I was a scribe in ancient Egypt, and then I was a knight in medieval times. Well, yeah, that's probably, by the law of probability, that's probably not quite true. Perhaps your imagination running wild a bit. You probably would have been a farmer, then a farmer, then a farmer, then a farmer. Maybe a soldier at one point. Probably just spearman, man-at-arms kind of thing. But in any case, the old Roman ideal was the citizen farmer. Now let me explain. When we say citizen farmer, that's basically an upright, self-sufficient man who worked his own small plot of land to feed his family and provide a surplus to support the state. Subsistence farming, essentially. Let's go back to the early republic. At this time, many citizens indeed lived in the countryside of Italy as small-time farmers, growing grains like wheat, barley, millet, along with olives too, grapes and vegetables. Even famous statesmen often paid homage to farming. Cato the Elder, a 2nd century BC senator known for his stern traditionalism, yes, we can put it that way, I suppose, wrote a manual called On Agriculture, which is the oldest surviving Latin prose work. I did a full reading of it, actually. You can find it in the reading section. In any case, well, not a full reading, just a partial reading of the important parts. Excuse me, I should correct myself. Well, in this work, Cato gives practical advice on how to run a farm. He'll tell you everything from how to plant olives and cabbage, even up to how to manage slaves and when to sell off a draft oxen. As far as Cato was concerned, farming was more than an economic activity. It was a moral one. He believed that the farmer's life instilled virtues like hardiness, frugality, and devotion to family and gods. He famously rated agriculture as the noblest way to make money, higher than commerce or, heaven forbid, usury, reflecting the long-standing Roman respect, at least in theory, for the simplicity of a simple rural life. And later writers like Varro and Columella followed in Cato's footsteps, penning extensive treatises on agriculture in the 1st century BCE and 1st century CE respectively. Columella, writing under the Empire, lamented that many aristocrats had begun to neglect their farms, leaving them to hired workers. But he still provided detailed instruction on everything from viticulture, that is, wine growing, to beekeeping. From these agricultural writers, we can see a little bit of insight into the daily and seasonal rhythm of farm work. You have the sowing and ploughing in autumn, the pruning of the vines in winter, harvesting in summer, and of course an endless list of tasks like threshing grain, pressing olives, repairing tools, and, if you've got them, shearing sheep. But for the average small farmer or farm laborer, life was labor-intensive, and often even a little bit dangerous. Most farming was done by hand with simple tools, iron tools if you were lucky. A farmer's toolkit consisted of plows pulled by oxen or mules, sickles for cutting grain, spades and mattocks, among other implements that had changed little since earlier antiquity. But the work was backbreaking. Just imagine it, cutting acres of wheat with a sickle under that Mediterranean sun, or stomping grapes into juice with your feet during the wine harvest. Rural families typically all worked together too, men, women, and children, especially at harvest time when extra hands were needed. We hear less about women in the elite authors' discussions of farming, since those writers were more interested in male property owners, I suppose. But in practice, a farmer's wife and daughters would be deeply involved in the daily operations of the farm. They milked animals, tended the vegetable gardens, kept poultry, and process food, churning butter, grinding grain, baking bread, those sorts of things. But they also spun wool and made clothing for the family, tasks pretty important for the household economy. On smaller farms, hiring outside labor was a luxury, so a large peasant family was itself the entire workforce most of the time. But by contrast, we have larger estates, known as latifundia. We're looking at the late Republic and Empire times, and they relied increasingly on enslaved labor. You see, conquests had flooded Italy with enslaved people, and when there's more supply, things get a bit cheaper. Wealthy landowners could amass huge holdings where dozens or even hundreds of slaves worked under an overseer. The existence of these slave-run estates gradually pushed many free peasants off their land. They were just unable to compete with the big boys, and may have contributed to migration into cities in search of work. But still, throughout the provinces of the empire, from Gaul to Syria, most villagers had free smallholders as well as tenant farmers who rented plots from landlords. A tenant farmer paid rent, often in the form of a share of the crop, which meant that a bad harvest could be disastrous, potentially putting him into debt or forcing him to borrow grain to make good on the rent. Well, despite the difficulties, farming could be modestly profitable in good years, and a few common farmers did manage to rise to prosperity. For example, the grain and olive traders were vital to Rome. A farmer who had surplus could sell it at a market or to merchants. Regions like Egypt and North Africa provided enormous grain surpluses that fed the cities of the empire. While those provinces were dominated by large estates, they also employed countless local laborers and farmers. The daily life of a farm worker started before dawn. Roman agricultural calendars, some visual examples survive actually in a few almanacs and mosaics, lucky for us, show the farmer up early, often praying to household gods for a good day's work, then yoking oxen to plow or going out to weed the fields at first light. Sounds like a riveting time. The midday sun in the summer might mandate a short rest. It's actually the origin of the term siesta, by the way. But more often than not, labor continued until dusk. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, which I do recommend you read as a primary source, comments on various farming practices and marvels at certain techniques, such as grafting fruit trees. But he also soberly notes the hardships behind agricultural wealth. In one passage, Pliny observes how luxury tastes in Rome, like the appetite for exotic spices or expensive wines, drive relentless labor in far-flung places. And even when meeting the deadlines becomes difficult, costing human lives. He describes, for instance, the dangerous work of gathering silphium, which is, by the way, now extinct. Now, this had to be done in desert conditions, and also mining precious metals used to buy luxuries, implicitly acknowledging the human toll behind the empire's riches. Now, you think you'd get away with farming being pretty easy, right? Not exactly. While it wasn't as overtly hazardous as mining, it was no less demanding. Injuries, exhaustion, and exposure to the elements were constant risks. A poor harvest due to drought or pests could bring starvation. So while Roman writers idealized the farmer, the reality for many agricultural laborers was a very hard-scraped existence near subsistence level. And I suppose it's all good for the Roman writers to sit back and write about how being a farmer is, but they're doing it while they're sitting in the shade. In any case, It's worth mentioning that retired soldiers were often settled on agricultural land as a reward for service, a policy used by generals and emperors to both reward troops and colonize frontiers. These ex-legionaries, battle-hardened but usually with farming backgrounds to begin with, would take to farming small plots in their veteran colonies. Even for them, the plough and the mattock replaced the sword, showing how, in the end, Rome expected even its warriors to go back to the fields. And so, agriculture effectively remained the default occupation for the vast majority of people across the empire's span, from the Italian heartland to the provinces. Though we have fewer personal stories of individual farmers, the archaeological record, farm tools and museums, remains of farmhouses, and analysis of plant and pollen remains confirms that tending the land was pretty much the basic heartbeat of Roman working life. Every little loaf of bread that fed Rome's urban population, every amphora of wine or olive oil, it was ultimately the fruit of someone's sweaty day in the field or grove. Okay, so let's get beyond farming now. Of course, Rome had a pretty big variety of craftsmen and craftswomen too, actually, producing all manner of goods. In city workshops and rural cottages alike, skilled hands fashioned the tools, clothing, and all those little everyday items that the Roman citizen needed. Many trades that still exist today were practiced in Rome, and some were far from pleasant. So let's start with one of the, smelliest but most essential urban industries. We've already mentioned it. Fulling, or cloth finishing and laundering. Now a fuller, or in Latin fullo, was essentially a professional cleaner of textiles, who also processed newly woven wool cloth to soften and whiten it. The fullers of Rome were both proverbial and infamous for their cleaning agent of choice, which was, believe it or not, human urine. Now it sounds a bit strange, but urine actually contains ammonia, which is an excellent natural detergent. The fullers set out large jars on street corners for people to urinate into. Passers-by were encouraged to relieve themselves into these jars rather than onto the street, which, public bathrooms, I suppose. In any case, the collected urine was then allowed to stale a bit and poured into soaking vats in the laundry workshop called the Fullonica. Slaves or workers would dump soiled togas, tunics, and woolen fabrics into a vat of urine and water, then stomp on the textiles with their bare feet, much like you do with treading grapes, to work the liquid through the cloth. This loosened dirt and grease from the fibers. The cloth might then be rinsed, brushed with clay or fuller's earth to draw out the remaining oils, and then dried on frames. Now the results, apparently, were quite good. Bright white togas and thoroughly cleaned fabrics for Rome's fashion-conscious citizens. But the smell. Imagine the smell. Fullers were commonly lampooned for stinking of the urine that they worked with. The odor of their workshops was so noxious that it gave rise to a famous imperial quip. In the 1st century CE, Emperor Vespasian imposed a tax on the urine collected for fullers' use, essentially capitalizing on a very lucrative business. When his son, Titus, objected to the idea of making money from urine, Vespasian held up a coin from the first payment and then asked whether it smelled bad to him. Titus admitted that it did not, to which Vespasian replied, "Pecunia non olet." Money doesn't stink. Well, that phrase has echoed through the ages as a cynical proverb, because I suppose when you're looking for profit, you don't really think about its source. And indeed, despite being looked down upon socially, successful fullers could make very good money. Their services were always in demand. Every respectable Roman needed clean clothes and well-finished new fabrics. In Pompeii, archaeologists found a very large phallonica, that is the phallonica of Stephanus, complete with washing vats and drying racks, indicating a thriving operation. And interestingly, the fullers in some cities formed guilds and even dedicated temples to their patron deities. In Pompeii, a prominent woman named Eumachia founded a large building in the Forum that seems to have been the headquarters of the Fullers Guild. And that shows that fulling, smelly or not, was a very organized and important craft. But we probably won't be doing any experiments at home for fulling, I assume. And if you do, I don't want to know. Well, let's move on. Many other craftsmen plied their trades in cities and towns. We have bakers, who were critical because bread was the staple food of the urban diet. A number of bakeries have been excavated in Pompeii and elsewhere, and that gives us a window into the daily work through the lens of archaeology. A typical Roman bakery had large stone mills to grind grain into flour, powered by either donkeys or by slaves trudging endlessly in circles. The hourglass-shaped millstones, made of volcanic lava rock, would crush grain poured in from the top, and flour and dust filled the air with surely rough effects of the lungs of those working around them. The flour was then mixed with water to make dough, kneaded in big basins and then formed into loaves. Most Roman loaves were round, marked off in sections on top and sometimes stamped with the baker's insignia, and ovens were often beehive-shaped brick structures, similar to modern wood-fire pizza ovens. I'm sure you've seen the ones, where the loaves were baked on the hot floor. And let me tell you, the wood-fire ovens are always so much better than the electric or gas ovens. So much better. You can tell the difference even just from the look of it, the look of the product, not just for pizza, but for bread, focaccia, everything. Yes, always choose the wood-fire option. Anyway, baking started well before dawn. A city like Rome had thousands of mouths to feed every morning, and bakeries had to churn out huge volumes of bread. Enslaved workers likely did much of the heavy work in commercial bakeries, while the master baker oversaw production and handled sales. The wealthy freedman Ulysses, whose tomb we met in the introduction, made his fortune in the baking business. The frieze on his tomb depicts step by step the process of bread making. Figures pouring grain into the mills, kneading the dough, and pulling loaves out of the oven is essentially an advertisement in stone of the craft that raises social status. Rinse and repeat. Pretty simple. And indeed, good bakers were valued. Bread was so fundamental that in times of economic hardship, the Roman government even took over some of the grain supply and distribution. By the late Empire, the Collegium of Bakers in Rome had semi-official duties to ensure the populace got its daily bread, reflecting how strategic their work was. Another ubiquitous trade was metalworking. Blacksmiths and bronzesmiths created tools, weapons, kitchenware, and of course construction hardware too. That's right, the job of a blacksmith wasn't just to churn out swords and spears and all the rest, also many practical concerns. In a Roman city, one would hear the constant clanging of hammers on anvils from the smithies. In fact, the poet Juvenal complained about the noise of craftsmen in Rome. He describes how a person living in a noisy insula, that is an apartment house, might be kept awake by the perpetual pounding of a coppersmith next door, or awakened at dawn by a carpenter's work. Well, this tells us that smiths' workshops were often embedded in residential neighborhoods, and that they worked at all hours. Iron tools like axes, shovels, knives, and nails were mass-produced by skilled smiths using simple forges and bellows. But beyond everyday tools, there were also specialized metal workers, armorers to equip soldiers, makers of surgical instruments for physicians, believe it or not, they had them, and jewelers crafting fine jewelry of gold and silver for the wealthy. Goldsmiths and silversmiths often had higher status among the artisans. Some even had their own guilds and patron deities. For example, the goldsmiths of Rome worshipped Vulcan, the smith god. And we have evidence, too, that women participated in certain metalworking trades. For instance, inscriptions from the city of Rome mention women called bracciarie, craftswomen who worked with gold leaf or gold foil, typically making gilded wreaths and jewelry. In one case, a husband and wife team are recorded. Fulginius, gold leaf worker, and Fulvia, gold leaf worker. Precariatus and Precariara. Now this reminds us that although many heavy crafts were dominated by men, sure, women could also put their hand to skilled labor, especially in family business where it was an all-hands-on-deck operation. Couldn't afford to have anybody sitting around doing nothing. And then construction and masonry. That was another important employment sector, and quite a big one, too. Rome and other cities were constantly building and renovating. You're talking temples, baths, houses, aqueducts, amphitheaters, roads. All of it needed armies of workers. There were stonecutters, brickmakers, plasterers, mosaicists for those beautiful tiled floors, painters, and also unskilled hod carriers for hauling materials. Much of the heavy construction labor was performed by slaves or by free poor laborers on a daily wage. The Roman state and wealthy contractors would hire crews for public works. And let's just give you a sense of scale here. The construction of the Colosseum in the 70s CE involved thousands of workers over 10 years, from skilled engineers and architects to the legions of unmanned laborers quarrying the stones, mixing the concrete, and yes, the Romans did have concrete, and of course lifting the blocks into place. Work conditions on big sites could be dangerous. Accidents, collapses, or exposure to limestone dust were hazards. Yet construction work, when available, was a vital source of income for many urban men. A relief from a tomb of a building contractor even shows workers paving a road and erecting a monument, indicating pride in the craft of building. Of course, we have another related job. That was brick and tile making. Large brickyards would press clay into standardized brick sizes and roof tile shapes and fire them in kilns. Many bricks in the empire bear stamps of the estate or legion that produced them, suggesting some were made by slave labor on imperial estates or by soldiers as parts of military works. But private brickyards, they also existed, often owned by senatorial families. And interestingly, Roman women are known to have owned brick factories as part of their portfolios. That was a kind of investment rather than them working there, but it shows the integration of all classes in economic life. But we're talking about high-born women, still quite rare. Of course, we can't go past pottery, another essential trade. Potters produced everything from fine tableware to coarse kitchen pots and amphorae for transporting wine and oil. Pottery workshops might be small family affairs or perhaps large enterprises employing dozens. The famous pottery industry of Arretium in Italy, or Arezzo in the common vernacular, exported its wares widely. And when we look at the potters' stamps and kiln sites, archaeologists have found that some potters were free citizens, but others were likely slaves working under a master potter. Pottery was generally lower status work, but still skilled. A master potter had to know how to select clay, shape vessels on the wheel, decorate them if high-end, and fire them without any breakage. Again, women in lower classes might assist in tasks like painting lamps or carrying clay, but the master potters named in records are mostly men. Now let's include a bit of a talk on textile production too. We can't go past that when it comes to Roman trades. Much of textile work was done within the household, sure, but there were also professional weavers, dyers, and cloth merchants. Large-scale wool workshops existed too, some staffed by slaves, turning out cloth for sale, whether it be locally or for export. Fine fabrics like linen, dyed woolens, or even imported silk were sold in urban markets, and women were heavily involved in this textile economy, both professionally and informally. The traditional virtue of a Roman matron included skill at the loom. Elite women were praised for weaving clothes for their family, but poorer women might take on outside work, spinning yarn or weaving in their own homes for a bit of income. In the urban setting, you might find a textrix, that is a weaver woman, or a sutrix, a seamstress, advertising her services. Tailors and cobblers, that is shoemakers, had small shops of their own too. One inscription commemorates a shoemaker who proudly made and sold footwear in his district. Well, in the dyeing trade. Well, I suppose we can't say that, but the dyes trade. Purple dye was the most famous and expensive, obtained from murex sea snails, primarily in Phoenicia. But common dyers used cheaper plant-based dyes for everyday clothing. And here's the dark human detail. Because fullers and dyers dealt with pungent substances, these workshops were usually located in designated quarters or outside the city centers to keep the strong odors at a distance from the genteel classes. Of course, that comes along with its own dangers, but they shall not have died in vain. Now, we should also mention the food and trade crafts. Butchers, fishmongers, vintners. Butchers, let's start with them. They slaughtered animals and sold meat in the market. We all know that. It was a skilled but bloody trade, often unpleasant but indispensable. Well, it was so much so that butchers often were outside the city gates or kept in specific markets to confine the mess. And they needed strength to handle livestock and sharp knives to dress carcasses. Romans consumed a lot of pork, by the way, so swine butchers were particularly common. Fishmongers sold fresh or salted fish in coastal towns along the Tiber in Rome, and one could find stalls with the catch of the day pretty easily, as long as you were close to a body of water. There were also more specialized jobs like garum makers. Garum was the famous fermented fish sauce that Romans adored, similar to modern Asian fish sauce. Certain coastal communities in Spain and North Africa had factories too where masses of fish guts were left to ferment in vats under the sun to produce this sauce, which was then exported in amphorae. And you can imagine how smelly that was. Well, smelly business certainly, much like everything else in Roman industry, but very lucrative if you hit the right recipe and market. Meanwhile, vintners and wine merchants oversaw vineyards and the blending of wines. Tavern keepers would then sell wine, often of dubious quality, to the working class by the cupful at local inns. But what were the earnings of these various trades? That's a little bit difficult to say. The evidence is scattered, I suppose. But there is one remarkable source from the late Empire that gives us a few clues. In 301 CE, Emperor Diocletian issued an edict on maximum prices, an attempt to curb inflation by fixing the maximum price of goods and the wages for various jobs. Though it likely failed to be effective, it does give us a little bit of a snapshot of relative values. According to this edict, a farm labourer's daily wage with meals provided was set at 25 denarii. A skilled carpenter or baker could earn double that, 50 denarii a day, and that includes meals. A barber could charge perhaps a few denarii for a haircut. Interestingly, the edict lists teachers' wages. An elementary school teacher could get 50 denarii per pupil per month, whereas a teacher of Greek or Latin literature could command 200 per student per month, and a highly respected rhetoric teacher up to 250, reflecting the higher social value placed on advanced education. A midwife's fee, not listed in the edict but known from other sources, might vary greatly. But exceptional midwives or physicians could earn sizable sums from wealthy clients. You just had to get the wealthy clients first, I suppose. Well, all these figures show that manual labor jobs provided a subsistence living at best, whereas skilled trades and professions could elevate one to a more comfortable status, especially if you could develop a wide clientele through word of mouth and good reputation. But of course, these are maximum legal rates. Actual pay might have been lower, and probably was. And the currency had been debased by 301 as well, so the actual buying power of a denarius was not what it had been in the early empire. But still, the ratios are pretty telling. An artisan might earn in 1 day what a farm worker earns in 2, and an expert teacher could make in a month what the basic teacher made in 4. And that shows stratification within the working class, that's for sure. Now, of course, where there are goods to be sold, and surpluses of them, there must be trade. And ancient Rome had a very vibrant commercial system. Markets bustled in every town and every city, and trade routes spanned the Mediterranean and beyond. Many Romans made their living not by producing goods, but by buying, selling, and transporting them. The simplest level was the market vendor or the shopkeeper, known in Latin as tabernarius. Stroll through an ancient Roman city and you'll go past countless little shops lining those streets, and they were often one-room storefronts with wide openings to the street, sometimes with a counter out front. And here was the place where a person might sell bread or olives or cloth or any little specialty that they had. Pompeii is a good example. Archaeologists have identified bakers' shops with built-in bread ovens, wine bars with jars sunk into the counter to hold wine, and shops that sold grains and staples. Some shops were permanent, others temporary stalls just set up on market days when things were a bit busier. You know, weekends, stuff like that. Or at least the days where people were resting. Wasn't too many of them, but think about festival days, stuff like that. Now, many of the shopkeepers were freedmen or freeborn plebeians. These people worked long hours just to scrape by, especially in the crowded city of Rome where competition was very fierce. We have an amusing piece of graffiti from Pompeii, where a shopkeeper wrote a message essentially advertising his wares, and of course complaining about customers who don't pay their debts. A pretty relatable business complaint across time. Women could be shopkeepers too, by the way, especially in certain trades like selling produce, perfumes, and small homewares. The poet Martial makes a passing mention of women shop owners in Rome, and later records and legal texts indicate women engaged in retail markets, though often their work might be labeled under their husband's name if it was a family enterprise, so we have to keep that in mind as well. But beyond the local markets, there were larger-scale merchants and traders who connected producers with consumers across the empire. Some merchants specialized in a particular commodity. There were grain merchants, olive oil merchants, livestock dealers, wine traders, cloth importers, spice traders, etc. Successful merchants usually were of the equestrian class or enterprising freedmen, since it took capital to run long-distance trade. For example, the grain trade that kept Rome fed was a massive operation. Large ships carried Egyptian and North African grain across the sea to the port of Ostia. The people who owned and ran these ships were often wealthy provincials or members of the local aristocracy in these regions. They made profits, but they also had quite a few responsibilities. It wasn't easy work, that's for sure. The state also sometimes subsidized grain shipping to ensure supply. That's how important this was. But another important trade was in olive oil and wine. Amphorae with stamps show that Spanish olive oil and Gallic wine were shipped in enormous quantities. Many of these amphora shippers were private merchants. Some even formed partnerships or joint ventures reminiscent of companies, though not incorporated in the modern sense. In port cities and major crossroads, one would find the negotiators, a broad term for businessmen, negotiating deals, securing cargo and lending money for trade ventures. There were also money changers and bankers facilitating commerce, since currency exchange and credit were needed when dealing across regions. Transport itself was a considerable industry. By land, wagoners, muleteers, and drivers made a living hauling goods. The Roman roads would be filled with ox carts, carrying produce to town, and mule caravans moving merchandise. These teamsters were typically free lower-class men. Some might own their cart, others might be hired by a merchant. And then there were inns along the roads providing rest for these travelers, and indeed innkeeping was a job often undertaken by freedmen or even wives of tradesmen. In Roman comedy and literature, the innkeeper is sometimes portrayed as a sly or unrefined character. These were not high prestige jobs, that's for sure, but they were certainly necessary for the flow of commerce and travel. But what about by sea? Well, on the water, skilled sailors and ship captains, often of Greek or Eastern origin, since those regions had ancient seafaring traditions, manned the merchant ships. To be a common sailor on a grain ship crossing the Mediterranean was dangerous and, frankly, quite low paid. You had to deal with storms, pirates, and long stints away from home. It's all part of the sailor's life. We have a few less pirates these days, but the storms and the isolation is still quite prevalent in that line of work. But a captain or owner of successfully delivered goods could make a good bit of coin. One famous figure, though earlier in history, was the Apostle Paul. Not a merchant per se, but we know that he made his living as a tent maker and occasionally traveled with merchant vessels to spread Christianity. His letters and the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament give incidental glimpses of travel and work. For example, Paul mentions supporting himself by manual work. Tent making was leather and canvas work, by the way, pretty humble craft, showing that even a man on a spiritual mission had to earn a bit of coin in between preaching. No free handouts to sustain him, I'm afraid. But back in the urban markets, you could find that they had their own jobs as well. Auctioneers who sold goods, scribes to write contracts and receipts, and porters who carried heavy loads for hire. Imagine the forum of a big city, chaotic on market days, with cries of hawkers, jangling of mule bells, and porters sweating under sacks of grain and big heavy amphorae of wine. A number of inscriptions in Rome commemorate porters and dock workers. One group, called the Scapharii, were the barge rowers who moved cargo up the Tiber from the seaport at Ostia to Rome's city docks. They formed a collegium and even set up dedications to their patron deities, evidence of a shared work identity. The fact that some saved money to inscribe tombstones suggests that their jobs, though tough, gave them a sense of community and at least a modest livelihood. It is interesting that while aristocrats spurned commerce as beneath their dignity, the Roman economy absolutely depended on it. Equestrians, that is the second tier of the elite, often filled the gap, running the tax collection business and trade syndicates. Some freedmen, being unburdened by aristocratic scruples, also jumped into business, and sometimes even outpaced noble families in wealth. The fictional Trimalchio in Petronius' satire, for example, had ships plying the seas and warehouses full of goods. He brags about weathering storms that nearly ruined him, and cleverly diversifying his cargoes. And that shows real stories of men like him are just a reflection of the art. And even if Rome's traditional upper class looked down on trade, by the imperial era, many an emperor quietly relied on capable freedmen administrators to manage imperial procurement, shipping, and supply lines. Well, some of these high-ranking freedmen, like Emperor Claudius's secretary, Narcissus, effectively ran large parts of the imperial administration, a job of organization and logistics, if not trade in a common sense. But let's move away from the broader world and get back to the cities themselves, as the cities themselves offered a host of service jobs beyond manufacturing and trade. Well, let's take public bathing establishments as the first example. They were central to Roman urban life, and they required numerous attendants. The great baths, thermae, in a city like Rome or Carthage, were like community centers with pools, saunas, and even exercise yards. Bathhouse workers included the bath superintendent, the balneator, furnace men tending the fires that heated the water and air, masseurs who oiled and scraped bathers' skin with stridules, and even the towel attendants. Many of these workers were slaves or freedmen employed by the bath's proprietor, the state, or perhaps a private entrepreneur. They might also sell snacks or drinks at the baths. One graffiti from a provincial bath complains about thefts, presumably warning bathers to watch their clothes, indicating that sometimes even informal jobs like cloakroom attendant or guard were necessary, and sometimes derelict. Now, just quickly, whenever I think of Roman baths, there's a great Japanese film starring Hiroshi Abe, or Abe Hiroshi, rather, whichever way you want to do it. It's called Thermae Romae. Now, it's essentially about a modern, well, a Roman man who gets sent into a modern Japanese bathhouse. He kind of gets sucked through time, and he brings back the modern ideas in a Japanese bathhouse back to ancient Rome and makes quite a name for himself within doing so. It's quite an interesting film, so I will suggest that you go and watch that. The actor is just great. Anything with Abe Hiroshi in it is just brilliant. Well, let's move on. We've mentioned taverns and inns. Let's go into a little bit more detail with them. Well, they employed cooks too, serving boys and girls, perhaps even musicians to entertain guests. And we know that selling food and drink was a common way to make a living in cities. Even small street stalls selling hot porridge or mulled wine are attested to in the old primary sources. The satirist Juvenal makes a jibe about the smell of fried fish and cheap shops, showing how integral street food was to the urban atmosphere. Running a tavern or a wine shop was one of the few somewhat independent businesses a lower-class woman might be noted for. For instance, one Pompeian bar, essentially an ancient pub, may have been managed by a woman, as a feminine name is associated with it in a political endorsement painted on the wall. Do keep in mind, though, women couldn't vote, rather, but interestingly they could still informally support candidates. Perhaps the bar's owner, female or male, put up the sign. But in any case, tavern keeping was a tough job. Late hours, rowdy patrons, and of course a social stigma of immorality clinging to it. Yet, taverns provided valuable services: food, drink, lodging to travelers and locals alike, and thus sustained those who ran them. And perhaps I'll do a full video on ancient Roman taverns. If you want to hear about that, leave me a comment, let me know. Now, another important service field was education and literacy. Formal education was not universal, but many families of some means sent their children, especially their sons, to primary school. The primary teacher, or literator, often conducted lessons in a rented room, or even a public colonnade. These schoolmasters were not highly paid. In fact, Juvenal quips that the pay of a teacher was less than that of many manual laborers. Despite having to manage and deal with a classroom of noisy young lads. And I used to be a teacher, so I know exactly what that is like. It's difficult to manage, that's for sure. In any case, a teacher might be a struggling free citizen or freedman, sometimes even an educated slave hired out by his master. Above the primary level, there were grammaticus teachers, that is, teaching literature and language, and rhetoricians for advanced studies. These could earn more and might gather students from elite families. Yet even the star professors complained of being undercompensated by stingy parents. One letter from Pliny the Younger to a friend in his hometown encourages the community to collectively fund a good school teacher, showing that even finding money to pay teachers was an issue. So, being a teacher in Rome was a respectable job in theory, but in practice it could be financially meager. Somewhat precarious profession too, unless one landed a patron or a role tutoring a rich man's children privately. It was also a profession in which Greek immigrants or Greek-speaking slaves thrived, since Greek literature and language were part of good education. Many teachers in Rome were in fact Greek freedmen. Now, closely related were scribes and clerks. With a vast bureaucracy, Rome needed many literate clerical workers. Public scribes sat in the forum ready to write letters and legal documents for the illiterate, for a small fee. In the imperial offices, educated slaves and freedmen acted as secretaries, record keepers, and accountants. Let's take this for example. The emperor's central administration, called the officia, had hundreds of such personnel, often former slaves, meticulously keeping track of taxes, decrees, and correspondences. Now, while not glamorous, a post as a clerk or scribe for a great house or the government could be a relatively secure position, even somewhat influential if one had become indispensable to a powerful patron. Some ex-slaves of the emperor also rose to extremely high positions by effectively being the imperial civil service. At a more modest level, though, scribes in the marketplace might also double as reading letter writers, helping a soldier's illiterate wife send him a message on the frontier or drafting a contract for a merchant. They were paid by the line, or per task, as Diocletian's edict suggests, 25 denarii per 100 lines for high-quality penmanship, 20 for second quality. And then we have medicine. That was a practiced profession, but not formally licensed as it is today. It was a little bit more Wild West back then. There were doctors who gained reputations and clients, many Greek freedmen or immigrants, as Greek medicine was considered the best. A successful physician to the rich could earn a good living and even climb socially. Some doctors became wealthy enough to be equestrians too, and that is the secondary class. But on the low end, each legion had a medicus, often a soldier with a bit of training for treating wounds, and small towns had a local healer of varying skill. Women also served as healthcare providers. Midwives were crucial for delivering babies, and midwives were usually older, experienced women who knew herbal remedies and birthing techniques. They might not have formal education, but some female practitioners did gain enough knowledge to be akin to doctors. In fact, inscriptions from around the empire honor a few women as medicae. For instance, a tombstone from Rome commemorates a woman named Julia Saturnina as, quote, the best doctor, and praises her virtuous life, suggesting, of course, that she was widely recognized for her skill with medicine. Another inscription in Gallia, that is France, refers to a woman who was a physician who, quote, delivered her fatherland from disease. Well, such evidence, though sparse, does tell us that women could and did engage in the healing professions, likely attending to women and children mostly. However, like many jobs in Rome, medicine had its charlatans. There was no formal regulation beyond reputation alone, so if a physician's treatments failed, they might simply slip out of town to avoid the angry patients. Mr. McGregor with a leg for an arm and an arm for a leg, that kind of thing. I'm sure you know the reference. Well, nonetheless, skilled doctors like Galen, the famous 2nd century physician, though male, show that medicine was an esteemed craft at the higher levels. And another category of urban workers was the entertainer and performer. While perhaps not normal in the sense of majority, many people, including women and youths, found work on the stage or in the arena. Actors, musicians, dancers, acrobats. These formed a class of entertainers often hired for festivals, dinner parties, or public games. Acting in Rome was not a highly respected profession, but star actors could be popular and earn favors from admirers. We even have records of an actress named Fabia who specialized in mimes, or of female dancers who performed in public. These women performers actually walked quite a fine line, as they were often associated with courtesans. But some of them had real skill, and renown too. But what about the money? Well, to pay for a run-of-the-mill performer was pretty inconsistent, just like the entertainment industry now. Perhaps a share of the troupe's take, or a patron's gift. Meanwhile, the other side of entertainment, the world of gladiators and charioteers, was quite extreme and a perilous path to take. Gladiators were usually enslaved or condemned men, trained to fight in the arena as a blood sport. They were paid only if they won, and the real profit went to their owners or trainers. A few gladiators achieved fame, and if they survived long enough, could even win freedom and minor celebrity. But it was not a career that one chose freely, except in a few rare cases of volunteers, so we might exclude it as a, quote, job in the voluntary sense. Charioteers, however, while often starting as slaves, could become extremely well-compensated superstars. Chariot racing was the most popular sport in Rome. The racing factions, the blues, greens, reds, and whites, had fanatical followings. A talented charioteer who won races could accumulate substantial prize money, and also heavy bribes or gifts. The most famous example is Gaius Appuleius Diocles, a 2nd century CE charioteer, whose career winnings were inscribed on a monument in Rome. He won nearly 1,500 races and earned an astonishing 35.8 million sesterces over 24 years. Well, that sum was equivalent to the pay of thousands of soldiers, or the cost of dozens of villas by some modern calculations. It made him one of the highest paid athletes in history, even till now. Well, of course, most charioteers never reached such heights, and many died in spectacular crashes on the track. But nonetheless, it does show that even in ancient times, a form of sports and entertainment could catapult a skilled person, even low-born, to strategic wealth. And that's, well, I suppose one part of getting out of the slums. But cases like that were extraordinary. For the typical Roman entertainer, the street flute player, the singer at the tavern, making ends meet was a daily hustle, and social respect was quite minimal. Well, for our final section today, let's talk about probably the most unpleasant aspect, and that's the kids. We've already noted the early start that many children had in labor, but let's expand a bit. See, Roman children, if from a working-class family, typically learned by shadowing their parents or relatives. A farmer's son learned to plow and tend sheep as a boy. A blacksmith's boy would pump the bellows and fetch tools in his father's forge, gradually learning things by doing them and picking up the trade as he goes. Formal apprenticeships were not exactly codified in later guild systems, but in practice they certainly existed. A child might be apprenticed or sometimes even contracted to a craftsman to learn trade in exchange for labor. In a way, being a slave child in a household was a forced form of apprenticeship. One might be trained as a cook or seamstress from a young age to serve the household. Free children, too, could be unofficial apprentices. For example, a teenager might be sent to live with and learn from an uncle who is a carpenter in the city, spending several years in training before setting up enterprise on his own. One moving record of children's work is how they are commemorated when they die young. Several tombstones in the Latin West mention a child's role. One for a little girl may say that she was a lanifica, a wool worker, reflecting that even by the age of 10 or 12 she had an economic function. Another for a boy might call him a little shoemaker, or show him with the tools of that trade. Now, these inscriptions were likely erected by grieving parents who wanted to highlight that their child, though young, had been a contributing member of the family trade and had learned the basics of the family's work. It's quite a different mentality from today's. Romans didn't really sentimentalize childhood innocence to the extent that we do. Rather, they took a pride in a diligent child who could help out alongside the adults. But not all children worked full-time, of course. Many did a mix of schooling and chores, if their families could afford it. In poor families, as soon as a child could feed chickens or carry water, they had chores. By their early teens, the equivalent of high school age, many boys of the lower classes would be working nearly as adults, perhaps as an assistant in a workshop or out in the fields. Girls might be married by mid-teens, effectively becoming homemakers, which was itself a full-time occupation of managing domestic tasks. In urban contexts, one imagines a swirl of errand boys going through the streets delivering messages, or the young helpers of butchers pushing little handcarts of meat, a merchant's daughter minding the store for an hour while her mum steps away. All of these were small contributions, but they were part of that fabric of daily labor. Now, this concept of, quote, child labor as a social issue simply did not exist in antiquity. It was simply expected that children follow in the footsteps of their parents as soon as they were able to. In fact, even the concept of childhood was quite a strange thing. Only the privileged were exempt. An upper-class boy, instead of laboring, would be hitting the books. He'd be learning rhetoric and philosophy, preparing for a career in politics. An upper-class girl might be learning to manage servants or host dinners. Not physically demanding, I can admit that, but a kind of training for her expected societal role. Meanwhile, their less fortunate counterparts were cleaning, cooking, and crafting early on. Little 4-year-old boys being thrown down into mines and all the rest where the bigger people could not fit. Well, that's just the way it was. Okay, So this wasn't a video about grand battles or brave generals or anything like that. Nothing too gruesome either, except for a few little details and unpleasant things. Just about the normal people. We don't have many of their stories. We've only just got a few little hints. But, well, history's made up of a lot of different parts, isn't it? We can't just talk about all the things that have been written down, which is why we're very lucky to have archaeology as a practice. Those are the things that dig up those little details. Let us have a little peek into what an old bakery would have been like, an old weaver's workshop, and all the rest. Now, that to me is really interesting. Anyway, I'm going to thank the top tier supporters for making this all possible and ad-free. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Kerry, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Taubery, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Nefte, Alexander, Gokan, Dorsey, Vanita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison. Free American. Jennifer, Brittany, David, and Cody. Thank you very much. Okay, so if you enjoyed it, do the like and subscribe thing. You know what to do. Will we get to 1 million subs one day? I don't know. Maybe in a couple years' time. Maybe. We'll see if we can get to 200,000 first. We're past 150,000 now, which is good. Like to get to 200,000 by the end of this year, but I don't know. Time is ticking away. Not sure if we can do that, but who knows? Maybe you will spread the word for me. Thank you in advance. Good night, everyone. I hope you have a good day at work tomorrow. And lots of love to you all. See you in the next video.